بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الذي لا يبلغ مدحته القائلون ولا يحصي نعماءه العادون ولا يؤدي حقه المجتهدون، ثم الصلاة والسلام على الذي بعث رحمة للعالمين ليتمم مكارم الأخلاق، سيدنا ونبينا محمد وعلى آله الطاهرين وصحبه المنتجبين. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. Praise be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, whose worth cannot be described by anyone, whose bounties cannot be counted, and no one truly submits to him the way he deserves. We convey and greet the most noble of all prophets, the one Allah commissioned to be the blessing for everyone, Prophet Muhammad and his pure progenies. Sisters and brothers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to the seventh night of our program, Muharram 2020, from ICA. Assalamu alayka ya Abu Abdullah wa ala al-arwah allati hallat bifina'ik. Alayka minni salamullah abadan ma baqit wa baqiya al-layl wa al-nahar. ولا جعله الله آخر العهد مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين. روى مسلم في صحيحه عن حذيفة إنه قال: قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم: يكون بعدي أئمة لا يهتدون بهداي ولا يستنون بسنتي، وسيقوم فيهم رجال قلوبهم قلوب الشياطين في جثمان إنس. فقلت: يا رسول الله، كيف أصنع إن أدركت ذلك؟ قال: تسمع وتطيع، وإن ضرب ظهرك وأخذ مالك اسمع وأطع. The hadith that I'm narrating here today is from Sahih Muslim, one of the most authentic books of tradition in the Sunni tradition. The hadith Muslim narrates from Hudayfa, who said that the Holy Prophet told me, there will be political leaders after me that do not follow my sunnah, and nor they follow my guidelines. Men that have soul of the devil, shaitan, in the figure of human being. So Hudayfa asks what to do if he were to be present during such a time. And he claims that the Holy Prophet told him to submit, to listen to their command and follow their instruction. Even if they violated your right and persecuted and tormented you, you have nothing else to do but to listen and obey. As usual, we start with our brief recap of the themes that we discussed last night. The central theme for our conversation was how the concept of justice, so paramount in Islam, was violated by the second Khalif when it came to the distribution of the immense wealth that had come in the possession of the public treasury in Islam. The way to deal with it, he constructed an artificial, hierarchical, an aristocratic structure in which people were given huge amount of money simply because they were close to the Prophet, or they associated, or he liked them, or they supported the winning party one way or the other. This wealth came from zakat, from war spoil, land acquisition, jizya, and a number of other things. If the Holy Prophet intended to base the structure of a Muslim society or the Islamic society and governance on taqwa, if he desired for the society to be graded according to not according to the amount of wealth that they had and they possessed, but according to one's piety and taqwa, as the verse in the Holy Quran says, Inna akramakum inda Allah atqakum, the framework, the criteria for superiority and inferiority changes from wealth and position into taqwa. If taqwa was to be used as a standard that you judge people with it, and the rulers to be elected accordingly, where respect and honor will no longer be dealt with or dealt out on the basis of power and wealth, power is removed from wealth and assigned instead to the character of an individual, which taqwa dominates. And by doing so, the old conflict and hostility between poverty and privilege will be removed if they were to be implemented. That is, poverty loses its sting and wealth loses its glamour. And a poor person and the wealthy people will have to descend to the level of humanity and start from that level up before the Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That was the intended purpose. If you remember the hadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah salamu alayhi that I mentioned yesterday in his response to Asim, he said the leaders of the society are required, are commanded to structure and frame their life according to the lowest of the low economically within their own society, so that the sting of the poverty is removed and the poor people and the needy and the marginalized are not feeling despondent. If taqwa was supposed to do that, if the high, middle, or low class or strata within the society was not to be performed or constructed based on how much wealth you have or how little, but based on the loftiness of your character, where Quran defines as nafs al-ammara, nafs al-lawwama, and nafs al-mutma'inna. How much you submit to the command of God, naturally you are elevated. How little you submit and you follow your own ego and your craft, somehow navigate a path which is totally independent of what Allah wants, then you become lower than what the others are. Asfal al-safilin, ahsan al-khaliqin, that we have talked about in previous tafsirs of Quran that we had during the month of Ramadan. Wealth, class, honor, tribe, and so on had no meaning whatsoever. The honor that previously during the Jahiliyyah was granted to a particular strata within the society was removed and given to those who are more pious and more lofty. Inna akramakum inda Allah atqakum. He kept repeating the same thing. La farqa bayna Arabiyyan wa Ajami, wala bayna aswadan wa abyad, wala bayna Araban wa ghayra Arab, illa bit-taqwa. There is no difference between anybody based on this artificial construction and the strata that exist in social structure. What you really need to do, the balanced society that the Holy Prophet was commanded and commissioned to establish, لَقَدْ أَرْسَلْنَا رُسُلُنَا بِالْبَيِّنَاتِ لِيَقُومَ النَّاسُ بِالْقِسْطِ, so that people actively seek justice, establish justice, and create a stable social structure. If that was the intent, unfortunately, for which he spent days and night hard work to try to eliminate and establish a balanced society, unfortunately at Saqifa, and particularly after Saqifa, it just vanished. The schism between poverty and wealth came to dictate again, came back, and Muslim social structure began to, again from scratch, had its own lord of the manor and the serfs. The soldier from Egypt received $300. A Makki individual that didn't work hard at all for Islam received $600, 600 dinars or dirhams, and yet the wife of the Holy Prophet receives 12,000 dirhams each year. Sahaba Muawiyah and Abu Sufyan receive 5,000 dirhams each year, while a person that has struggled for the path of Islam receives pittance. This led, as I explained last night, to the new aristocracy, religious aristocracy, and I gave you a few examples of how much wealth these people collected and piled up at the moment of their death. Now, for the society that has come out of leadership as charismatic and balanced and just as the Holy Prophet, to accept and swallow this new, somehow hierarchical structure or aristocracy, religious aristocracy, the winning party had to find a plan. And the plan, those of you who are familiar with some of the textbooks, Chomsky in particular has a book called Engineering Consent, where he talks within the context of the Western powers and the Western governments, how do they go about creating consent within the society? This is exactly what they had to do at that time. They had to come up with a plan that the consequence of which, or the outcome of which, the society will consent to this hierarchical structure that was in favor of the rich at the expense of the poor. How did they do it? By creating literally a production line of fabricating ahadith, falsifying, inventing, and manufacturing hadith after hadith after hadith in favor of the winning party, starting from Abu Bakr, comes down to Umar, then Uthman, and goes to Muawiyah, Yazid, and the rest of the Bani Umayyah. So once you have created this step, then you need to sell it. How do you sell it? By repeatedly saying it again and again and again, so that people accept it as truth. Those of you who are familiar with the famous expression of Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propagandist leader, he said, if you tell a big enough lie and tell it well, but repeat it frequently enough and often enough, people will accept it as fact. Now we have books of these ahadith, full of them, as fact. Nobody challenges. So the project of distorting Islam by the winning party and distorting the history of Islam started with the fabrication, one major fabrication, which I call it the myth of non-appointment. That the Holy Prophet died and did not appoint anyone as a successor. That's the myth, the first myth. Because if that myth is not created, there is no rationality or legitimacy for those who have occupied the place. You have to force the community, throw it into their nostril or push it up their nostril that the Holy Prophet did not appoint anyone as a successor. And Abu Bakr starts with it. When he is challenged, on what basis you appointed yourself as a candidate, because there was nobody, there was no appointment. Even in today's academic discourse, when you go, the historians, even Sunni brothers and sisters, when they start talking about the life after the Prophet, immediately jump on this myth. Since the Holy Prophet did not appoint anyone, and there is no literature or anything about it, then society had to do something to structure itself. The myth of non-appointment theory. This was the beginning. And the government then, any single government that came after, took the responsibility of repeating the same thing again and again and again. Every time you question anybody, well, the Holy Prophet didn't appoint anyone. Once this was invented, it's very hard to accept. What this theory infers is that the greatest religious leader and that came to establish a great nation on earth, and the seal of the Prophet wasn't far-sighted enough to see that his time was limited, and the message that he was given needed to be protected from the Jahiliyyah supporters, that Quran defines them as munafiqun within his midst. If we accept that, then you are able to accept anything. You believe that, you believe anything. So the notion that the Holy Prophet was not far-sighted enough to see that after him, if he doesn't do anything, chaos will prevail, becomes the theory for this non-appointment. Now, if we accept such a reality, we might as well go from the beginning and say chaos produced the world, and be rest assured, go home and do whatever we want. And leaves the society in chaos, unstable, because he did not pay attention and was not sufficiently shrewd to understand that he really needed to train anyone to take responsibility after. Now I want to shift to the hadith that I started earlier, but I need to briefly address something. In Ilm al-Hadith, there is a huge discourse regarding Ja'al al-Hadith or Wad' al-Hadith, fabrication, falsification, invention, forging of ahadith. This is one of the challenges. Unfortunately, within the Sunni tradition, part of that project is that you create a number of books that you call them untouchable. You can't question them. You can't criticize them. You can't criticize the hadith within them. You simply accept them. Simply because the author, quote unquote, we consider as trustworthy. So this Ja'al al-Hadith, Wad' al-Hadith, or Ja'al al-Hadith, scholars say that literally you can trace it to the Holy Prophet himself. During that time, we had people, they were going around and fabricating a hadith and saying, Qala Rasulullah, Qala Rasulullah. Were necessitated for the Holy Prophet to say, whoever says anything that I have not said, on the day of judgment, he will be thrown in fire. So technically, this notion goes back to the Holy Prophet. So how many types of fabrication of ahadith do we have? Number one, to fabricate invent or forge a complete hadith that has no basis whatsoever. Sometimes the second type is that you take a hadith and then you add few words to it. أنا مدينة العلم وعلي بابها. This is a hadith, fully established. But for somebody to come and say one Khalifa is the gate to it, the other Khalifa is the ground to it, the other third Khalifa is the sky to it, this is the second type. It just doesn't make sense. أنا مدينة العلم وعلي بابها. A metaphorical use of language. That if you want to come access my knowledge, is through Ali. Now, Abu Bakr becomes the door to it, the wall to it. Omar becomes the ground to it, and Uthman becomes the ceiling. And nobody says, how can a city have a ceiling? It doesn't matter. This is the second type. So you take the hadith that has a base and you start manipulating it by adding few things here and there. The other one is to literally steal a hadith from somebody else and give it to somebody else. Huge number of ahadith from Amir al-Mu'mineen and Ahlul Bayt narrated from Umar, Muawiyah, Abu Bakr and Uthman in their books. We have clearly proof established that these are ahadith. Even words of Nahj al-Balagha have been taken and credited to somebody else. So these are various forms of fabrication. Why? What were the ultimate objective? First, to weaken the position of Ahlul Bayt. Particularly, the first specific target was Ali. Muawiyah spent huge amount of money to what we call the scholars of the court to fabricate a hadith against Amir al-Mu'mineen salawatullah salam. And then commanded, similar to what we see in Saudi Arabia, they command Imam of Masjid al-Haram, Masjid al-Nabi and everybody else to stand in front of everybody and recite these fabricated traditions. Commanded the Imams of various mosques and Jama'as to recite these ahadith. So when the collectors of hadith came in, it's already had a currency within the Muslim society. They took it. And nobody said anything. Number two, to legitimize the reign of various caliphs, the first three, but specifically Bani Umayyah. And to elevate the status of various individuals, whether it's the first Khalif, three Khalifs, or Muawiyah in particular. Muawiyah becomes Ahlul Bayt by these fabrications. There are a number of books for those of you who really intend to follow this topic, both in English recently. There are a number of dissertation theses regarding this issue by, strangely enough, Sunni scholars, that suddenly they have found out there is some kind of a challenge that we have to deal with. The image, they may look at it from a particular subject, say gender discrimination, human right, or something. The image of women within the hadith and the image of women within Quran, they don't tally, particularly from a Sunni perspective. So they decided to go back and start with a critical look at these ahadith, trying to establish where did this fabrication come. For this to take place, three steps were necessary. Number one, you had to elevate the hadith to the level of the scripture. Hadith become equals to Quran, becomes another central position, the same power with Quran. You don't need to even ask question. For God's sake, the content of this hadith does not work hand in hand with human intellect. In our analysis and ijtihad, we say the fourth principle of which a mujtahid has to rely on is aql, human intellect. كلما حكم به العقل حكم به الشرع. For you to establish and assess the truthfulness, it has to make sense. Whether it comes to the interpretation of the verses of the Holy Quran or giving the image of a female in various traditions. Now they are beginning to step back and say it doesn't make sense. It's really turning Islam on its head when other people look at it and says, on what basis? When a wife is being beaten up and then the husband is taken to court for domestic violence, and if he doesn't remember any other verse in the Holy Quran, he remembers this فَاضْرِبُوهُنَّ from Surah An-Nisa. Well, Quran says, beat them up. Ignorant community, the hadith has been elevated to the scripture, and the third component of this triangular thing is to prevent any critical analysis of the hadith. Hadith, from our perspective, we divide them in close to 60 different types. And one by one, there is a different criteria that we designate to each class. And what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. There is not a single book within the Shia tradition that the ulama don't go through and one by one they look at the hadith. Most of the differences in ijtihad that exist between scholars is because their understanding of a hadith are different from each other. But don't touch Sahih Bukhari. Literally, you can argue about the tafsir of Quran, whether the verse has been abrogated or not, but you can't touch Bukhari or Muslim or any of the other 6 books of hadith. Now, there are, at least when we look at the fabricators, I'm sure my brothers and sisters within the Sunni school, they are going to be throwing their hands up and says, why do I do this? Number 1 on the list is Abu Hurairah. Over 5,374 hadith he has invented. And he was with the Holy Prophet under 3 years. Now, simple maths, rule of the thumb. If the Holy Prophet would have given him an hour or 2 every day of this 3 years, assume that the Holy Prophet didn't do anything else during these 2 or 3 hours, and constantly talk to Abu Hurairah about hadith, he will not be able to come up with 5,700 and some hadith. And yet, these have been narrated. Ka'b al-Ahbar, a Jewish convert, said Murtada al-Askari has a book regarding the 150 falsified Sahabas. This is one of them. That he was used by Uthman every time he wanted to justify one of his deeds. If somebody came in and criticized him, why do you take Baytul Mal and the wealth of the people? He turned to Ka'b al-Ahbar, and Ka'b al-Ahbar came up with a hadith on Rasulullah. You have every right to do so. This is the guy that Abu Dhar hit him on the head and said, who are you to teach us our faith? Ubay ibn Ka'b, a huge number of ahadith has been fabricated by him regarding tafsir of Quran. Mind-boggling. Ibn Abi al-Awja, they say 4,000 hadith fabricated by this individual. He admits that I had fabricated 4,000 hadith and pushed it into the narrative that everyone accepts. Bukhari, for example, let's understand the character that he is. He is contemporary of Imam al-Hadi and Imam Hassan al-Askari. Contemporary of 2 Imams, and does not relate even one hadith from either of them. And yet, he narrates from Abu Hurairah over 465 hadith. From Abdullah ibn Umar, 270 hadith. Aisha 242 hadith, Abu Musa al-Ash'ari 57 hadith, Anas ibn Malik 200 hadith, Amir al-Mu'mineen 19, Fatima al-Zahra 1. This is the character. Now these ahadith, and when you look at some of these ahadith, they really demean the character of the Holy Prophet. In Sahih Sunan Abu Dawood, there is a hadith, I just picked it up today. The Prophet was urinating, listen, in public. This is the character of the seal of the prophethood. And Omar was standing behind him with a jug of water. He said, he turned his face to Omar, who was standing behind him with the jug. He said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "I'm holding a jug of water for you to purify yourself after you have completed your work." He said, "I don't have to do that. If I wanted to do all of this, it becomes sunnah. I'm not going to do it." What does this hadith infer? That Omar was more conscious of hygiene, cleanliness, a spiritual obligation than the Holy Prophet himself. It's a tragedy. Now go back to the hadith that I started. There are a number of hadith in Sahih Muslim regarding the same issue, not just an Hudayfa. Remember, now we are moving into specific, there is no corner that they have not turned. And Hudayfa, there is now in this hadith specifically regarding political issue. Now we criticize people, say, okay, why don't they rise against a corrupt regime? This is the hadith that the scholars of the court will recite. عن حذيفة قال رسول الله يكون بعدي أئمة لا يهتدون بهداي ولا يستنون بسنتي وسيقوم فيهم رجال قلوبهم قلوب الشياطين في جثمان إنس. قال قلت يا رسول الله كيف أصنع إذا أدركت ذلك؟ قال تسمع وتطيع. No more talk about justice. No more talk about social responsibility. No more talk about amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar. No more talk about balanced society, taqwa or anything else. When their leader is corrupt, I mean, it's very graphic description within this verse, this hadith, that their soul is evil, but in a body of human being. And when the person asks, what am I supposed to do? He says, obey their command and don't criticize. Now we go back to Ashura. This is why we say, قُتِلَ الْحُسَيْنِ بِسَيْفَ جَدِّهِ. Hussein was killed with the sword. What sword? These are hadith that said Hussein should not have risen against the power of Yazid or Bani Umayyah or anybody else. There are a number of other hadith. And Ibn Abbas, عن رسول الله, whether Ibn Abbas has said it or not, we don't know. من رأى من إمامه شيئا يكرهه فليصبر. If you see something from your leader that you detest, don't say anything. Be patient. فإنه من فارق الجماعة شبرا مات ميتة الجاهلية. If you slightly move away from the collective, then you might as well die the death of Jahiliyyah. Now you see how this industry that was created to change the reality have been successful. Now we have to struggle in this world to deal with the image that these ahadith have been created for us. I had a seminar about just before the COVID-19 that I went to Boston, human rights. And people who were sitting there, Christian, Jews, they had learned these ahadith backward from Ahl Sunnah, from Sahih Bukhari, from everything else. What are you talking about this hadith? What about this hadith? What about that hadith? This is the fundamental challenge. This is why I say Saqifa was the beginning of all the ills that the Muslims have been suffering after the demise of the Holy Prophet up to now. Inshallah, we will continue with our conversation tomorrow night. We switch to something else more relevant. Just before I finish, I want to read this hadith in Sahih Bukhari. He says, on the day of judgment, people come to Prophet Ibrahim and they say that, please come and intercede on our behalf. He says, I have lied 3 times in my life, so you go and find somebody else. Can anyone in the right mind, there is an expression in English, it says that unless you have swallowed the bait, the line and the sinker, you are not going to accept this kind of thing. You have to have a distorted mind that you accept this kind of ahadith. These are nothing compared to some of the derogatory ahadith. This is why some Christian Zionists come in and they say these books of ahadith are pornographic because of what they talk about the relationship between Aisha and the Holy Prophet and few other wives. I take refuge in Allah and ask Him to protect us from all evil, inshallah. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.